Live in a minute. Here we go. Hello, welcome to the third in our series of webinars with AMP Clean Energy. I'm Stuart Bowes, founder of Future Net Zero. Thank you for joining us. And we've left the best till last. Jill will say absolutely, won't you, Jill? This is exactly
very kind.
Jill Alker, say hello to everyone.
Hi, thanks for joining us this morning.
Jill is going to take us through the world of buildings. Now, if you've paid any attention to things that have been going on lately, you'll know just how important our buildings are in terms of how we're going to get to net zero. And that's what we're going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes discussing on this webinar. We'll be looking at how we take housing stock, office stock, the whole sort of buildings environment, which is one of those big things that, frankly, if you look at it, it's one of the things we've looked at transport a lot. We've looked at the energy system, and they've been, in some ways, slightly easier wins for all of us. I think buildings will be the biggest challenge. How, particularly in our country with our housing stock so old and our office buildings, many of them really, really not built for the energy efficiency world we want. So we'll be looking at that. If you've not used the platform before, then it's very simple. Bright Talk is a very simple platform where you can ask questions. Jill's very keen to answer those, so please ask questions as you listen to her presentation, and I'll put them to Jill towards the end. We also have a poll coming up, sort of 3/4 of the way through. That poll is very simple. I'll put the question up. You can just answer it. 3 or 4 sort of responses you can do, and then we'll look at that. And the other thing to do is to rate the webinar at the end. Please give us feedback so we know what we've done well, what we haven't done well. I'm sure it'll be brilliant. So without further ado, let me hand over to Jill, who'll take you through a presentation. Jill, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sumit. Okay, let's go with that. Right, so it helps if I have the first slide to me. Right, so as Sumit says, this is the last of 3 seminars in the series this week. On Tuesday, you will have heard Stuart Reid talking about industrial decarbonisation. On Wednesday, we heard Mark Tarry and Neil Stewart talking about hydrogen. And today, we're going to be talking about heat and buildings. I really hope that you caught the other 2 sessions, and if you didn't, please do catch up on the Bright Talk.
Yeah, you can watch it. You can watch them on Future Net Zero. They're up there now. Yeah, absolutely.
So they're really, really useful if you're interested in those topics. There's going to be some similarities between mine and their talks, but today we're mainly going to be looking, as Sumit says, at the non-domestic building heating emissions. I mean, those emissions are important for almost all organisations, whether they're public, private, large or small. Most organisations have got buildings that need heating and that have emissions associated with those heating. So hopefully everybody on this call, on this webinar, will be interested and find what I say relevant to their situation. So a little bit about myself. I am the head of consultancy for AMP Clean Energy, and I've worked in the renewable sector for over 20 years. I think it was something like 25 years, mostly in biomass and mostly in the non-domestic RHI field, but always heavily focused on renewable heat. These webinars are accompanied by a series of 6 policy briefing papers, and they're free to download, and I'll explain how to get those later on. They set out the current policy landscape. They're kind of policy cheat sheets, if you like, and we're giving those away for free, as well as the 3 that cover the subjects that Stuart and Mark and I have been talking about. We've also got one on reporting, monitoring and disclosure. So those big businesses that are affected by ESOS and SECR and those sorts of things, have a look at that. There's also one on electrification, and there's also one on carbon pricing. I'd just like to take the opportunity to extend our thanks to Kerry and Neil from Hutchison Associates, who've helped us enormously to pull all of this information together. Okay, a little bit about AMP Clean Energy first of all. There's 3 parts to our business, 3 main parts. The first part is that we are developers, funders, owners, and operators of decentralized low carbon assets. Now, what that means is that we help customers. Customers have asked us to help them decarbonize their businesses. So we've paid for and installed low carbon generation equipment, and we've entered into a long-term contract, a long-term agreement with those customers to supply the energy that we've produced from those from that equipment back to them. And that energy is often supplied at a lower price than they would have been paying for their fossil energy. We've got a range of different clients in this sector, so everything from small primary schools and hotels right up to big industrial sites. We're just about to put in a multi-megawatt biomass system into an industrial chemicals company, and we've recently just installed one in a whiskey manufacturer's. We've got about 180 of these assets, and we've got about £15 million invested in them. The second part of our business is providing flexible services to the grid. We've got a portfolio of peaking plants and batteries that are located across the country, and those are helping balance the power supply and the demand. What that means basically is that as the grid becomes more and more decarbonised by the use of solar and wind technologies, then those technologies are non-dispatchable, so they're not easily turned on and off. So in order to be able to fill the gap in demand and supply, you have to have easily dispatchable local decentralized plants such as peaking plants and batteries to be able to fill that gap, to balance out the market. We're always on the lookout for new sites to locate these flexible generation equipment. So if you have any small parcels of land near grid connections, then we'd be very happy to speak to you about possibly renting that space to be able to provide more of these assets. And the third part of the business is that we provide operation, maintenance and fuel supply to around 1,000 of our clients that have biomass boilers. So typical customers are schools, care homes, local authorities and small industrial premises. So moving on to the policy. In Stuart's webinar on Tuesday, he discussed the really big picture drivers. So he was talking about market dynamics, and he was talking about push policy push factors and societal pull factors. And he was discussing, you know, the COP, the IPCC, science-based targets and CCC. I always think about policy as being a hierarchy, and as you move down the hierarchy of policy, you get into more and more of the detail and the actual useful measures that can be applied to practical solutions. So for heat and buildings, we're really looking at the heat and building strategy that was published by the government in October last year. Heating is responsible for about a third of the UK's carbon emissions, and heating is responsible for about 80% of building emissions in the UK. So sorting out these emissions is really critical, and it's often the forgotten element of emissions in the country, well, across the world, to be honest. The way that this is going to be tackled is through these heat and building strategy elements. And the government has proposed in the heat and building strategy a number of things. So it's proposed phasing out fossil boilers. It's proposing tackling energy efficiency by building fabric improvements, and that should always be the first option. But after that, then they're taking a heat pump first approach when it comes to renewable heating. but they've also recognised that heat pumps aren't always the best, or aren't always possibly the best solution. So they've recognised that there is likely to be a mix of heat pumps, heat networks, biomass, direct electric heating, and others. In all situations, though, they will have an aim to support what they call low or no regrets options. So what that means is that they do not expect anybody to be retrofitting anything after those options have been implemented in order to then be able to get to net zero. So whatever is done should be able to deliver net zero by 2050. So how will this heat and building strategy be translated into specific policy measures? Well, the details around this are constantly coming out through various consultation documents at the moment. In the next few slides, we've split up into policy measures for new and existing building stock measures. So these are the policies for new building stock measures. The first one is coming into effect actually next Wednesday on the 15th of June, and that's the amendments to the building regulations. This is basically being implemented by improved fabric and fixed building services. So that's controls and lighting, and improvements in ventilation and monitoring it for infection control, so following COVID, and a 27% improvement in CO2 emissions compared to 2030 levels. So these measures are being implemented through building standards, and so any new building developers that want to tick the boxes of the building regulators, they will have to basically put in place better insulation, better lighting, better controls to make sure that those emissions are reduced by 27% compared to 2013 levels. And that's all done through various different pieces of software like BREEAM, which will effectively tell them whether or not they've met that level when they're doing their designs. So this is an interim step on the pathway to the future building standards, which are due to be introduced in 2025. And there's a consultation due out next year to finalise the details of that building standard. The building standard aims to create zero carbon ready buildings that won't require any further action, any further retrofitting to allow the buildings to reach net zero alongside grid carbonisation. So the aim of this is that by the time the electricity grid has been fully decarbonised, so will also all of the buildings that have been built whilst this building standard has been in place. So these two policies are the only real ones that cover new build at this stage for non-domestic buildings. But the vast majority of all the building stock in the UK has already been built. It already exists. So what's coming forward for the existing buildings? It's fair to say that the policies relating to existing building stocks are quite diverse. First of all, we've got the phasing out of fossil heating, and the consultation response. We've just had a consultation, and the responses are being reviewed at the moment. The government's proposed in that consultation to use the natural replacement cycle. So as a boiler comes to the end of its useful life, or if it breaks down, it can't be replaced like for like. It's got to be replaced by a low carbon alternative. They're also taking a heat pump first approach, although biomass hasn't been ruled out, and they've said that it will be supported in hard to treat buildings. But in practice, they've also recognised that there will be a mix of solar, of biomass, of heat networks, etc. There's no specific incentives, financial incentives associated with this, so it is more of a stick than a carrot policy. But government expects there to be a strong green finance market developed to take up the strain of the extra costs. So that's something to watch. So there's also a response due out on the private rented non-domestic sector. So if you own buildings that are rented out to the non-domestic sector, this applies to you. And this is a mechanism all about improving EPC ratings of buildings. So currently the standard is that they have to be E or better, EPC rating E or better. But from 2027, the EPC rating has to be C or better. And by 2030, it must be B or better. And that will mostly be about improving fabrics, because there is a 7-year payback exemption. What that means is that if the measures that it takes to improve the EPC take more than 7 years to pay back financially, then they're not going to be required. So that's unlikely to probably encourage renewable heating technologies. Finally, the onus on that one is going to be shifting from the requirement on the owner to the requirement being on the agent. And what that means is that the agents won't be allowed to advertise properties with an EPC rating of less than the current minimum at that time. So just another slide about existing building stock policies. There's been proposed some performance-based ratings for large buildings. So those are buildings that are larger than 1,000 square meters. And this is relating to display energy certificates. Those people who are involved in public buildings will already be aware of DECs, because they've been in place already for a few years for public buildings. But what's being proposed is that they will not just apply to public buildings, but all buildings that are greater than 1,000 square meters. Another change will be that they will be based on actual metered use, not just building design. So what that means is that they will actually represent how the buildings are being utilised, not just how they could be utilised. And obviously the emissions from a building are very dependent on how it's being used, and that's dependent on the sector that's using it. So there will be sector specific ratings. So there'll be a retail specific rating for a particular building. And that will help people easily compare between buildings used in the same way. These ratings will need to be investment grade. So there'll be rules about who must carry them out. And I think they're talking about chartership, making sure that only those who've been properly qualified can carry them out. And they will need to be updated annually. Finally, there's also some policy coming through about hydrogen in the gas network. But for those who are out there that think they can just wait until the gas network is switched over to hydrogen and then just change their boiler or their burner, I think it's worth just thinking that, just being aware that the decisions around hydrogen have still yet to be made. And it's unlikely that, well, it's more likely that hydrogen will be prioritised first in the transport and industry and storage sectors before the general gas network. And even the decision around relatively low risk of being able to blend hydrogen at quite low levels into the natural gas network won't be discussed even until next year. So the message is loud and clear from government that it's definitely worth rolling up your sleeves and getting on with decarbonising your building stock. So how do we pay for it? Financial incentives. So yes, the non-domestic RHI has closed for new participants, but it is still supporting renewable heat projects until 2041. And I've put this up here because there may be people out there who have existing RHI assets that aren't necessarily being used very well or don't work quite well for them. It's possible to reuse, to relocate, and to repurpose RHI assets. So if you do have an RHI accredited system and it's not working for you, consider reusing it somewhere within your own portfolio or selling it on to somebody who can use it in a different way. There's also the public sector decarbonisation scheme, which is administered by our old friend Salix. We are now into phase 3 and there are further phases to be coming through. This scheme covers energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation projects, and I had a quick look through at some of the past projects that have been funded, and it looks like the possibilities there are quite flexible, with lots of different measures being covered and lots of different people taking advantage of that. We've also got the brand new £5,000 boiler upgrade scheme, which is, I think, just this week coming into being launched and starting to be used. It isn't just for domestic; it's also possible to use this boiler upgrade scheme for non-domestic buildings. But the system size is limited to less than 45 kilowatts, so it's probably limited more to smaller buildings than larger ones. And it could potentially also be used for biomass, but only in off-gas areas and hard-to-treat areas, hard-to-treat buildings. Finally, we have what government are calling the market-based mechanism for low-carbon heat, and that's gone through a consultation, and there is another consultation due, a technical consultation due next year. This is going to be an obligation on fossil heating system manufacturers, and it encourages the ramping up of sales of heat pumps that are less than 45 kilowatts. Rather than them being able to sell fossil systems, they're going to be encouraged to sell low carbon systems. As I said, this still got to go through one more technical consultation next year, so the details are still a little bit sketchy, but again, it's probably going to be applying to not just domestic but non-domestic, but limited again to less than 45 kilowatts. So personally, it feels as if there is actually a real gap here in support for anything other than quite small schemes or schemes that are in the public sector. The incentive landscape has really changed over the last couple of years, and it's essentially turning from an era of carrot-based incentives to stick-based legislation and a much more punitive regulatory approach. The new policy landscape also seems quite unfocused, to me anyway, and I think many people who are responsible for reducing building-based emissions won't quite know where to go or what to do. So that leads us quite nicely onto the poll question, where hopefully you'll all prove me wrong. So over to Sumit.
I like that. This is almost like proper TV. Here we go. Here's your poll, ladies and gentlemen. Does your business organisation currently have a plan in place for decarbonising heat? Yes, we're set for 2050. Kind of. We have started discussions, but not got a plan. Nope. Only started thinking about it once I tuned into this. So here we go. Vote now, please. Does your business have a plan for decarbonising heat? Yes, we're all set. Kind of. We've started discussions, or no, we're just starting to think about it with the latest regulations. I'll leave that poll open, so then I'll hand you back to Gill to continue her presentation.
Okay, thanks, Sumit. So just moving now on to what are the solutions. So we've gone through all the policy, and we've decided that we're faced with a complex landscape with a diverse yet interconnected set of policies. So what can we do? Well, as always, the first point of call is energy efficiency. We should always be tackling that first and looking at the boring old insulation, double glazing, everything that you can think of. That, I mean, it has to be done. It's the first place to go. Then, should you wait and see what happens to hydrogen? We recommend not. You know, the decisions are far too far down the line, And as I said, it's likely that other sectors will be prioritised first. And in the meantime, it's, you know, we don't all have a crystal ball, but we suspect that probably, you know, the fossil fuel is going to get more expensive. So early adopters are almost certainly going to be benefiting. So what about heat pumps? If you can, definitely. I think it has to be the option. You know, government has made it very, very clear in a number of documents that heat pumps should always be considered first. But they don't work in every situation, and I'm sure that most of the people on this call are well aware of that. You've got to have the right space, you've got to have the right existing systems in place, and it doesn't always work. But it's always been the case that there is no one size fits all solution, and every single situation has to be looked at differently. And that's one thing that we've always tried to do. I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes just talking about some case studies, and I can explain what we've done in the past. So as I said earlier, we've got around 180 assets that I could have chosen from to show you with our case studies. I've decided to choose to show you some of the most challenging, probably because you can then see, well, if those guys can do it, then we can do it. What you can see here is 4 buildings that we've put in renewable heating systems for. All of these are older buildings. They're very drafty. Some of them are listed. I think the Croft School has some, sorry, not Croft School, Kingham School has some listed buildings. Norwich Cathedral is grade 1 listed, so it's as listed as it could be. In all of these, the first thing that we've made sure is that whatever measures, energy efficiency measures could be done, have been done. It's not always possible, but we've been able to ensure that those are done first. And in all of these, we have installed biomass, but that's purely because the policy landscape at that time meant that biomass was the right option. We had the renewable heat incentive. Not all of these are off the gas network. Not all of these have been replacing oil. Norwich Cathedral's right in the middle of a city, and they had gas before they had biomass. But the best fit for all of these, financially, logistically, and for carbon savings, was biomass in these situations. But we don't always recommend that. So just going through these very quickly, Huddersfield Golf Club had a number of buildings. We've put in a biomass system that's based on pellets, and we've connected up all of those buildings with a district heating network system. And now they're saving around 85 tonnes of CO2 per year. By the way, all of these customers, they all get a monthly report telling them how much CO2 they've saved in that month. So they have a live update, so they know what benefit the system has provided to them. Kingham High School, this is a private school in the Chilterns. We've put in 2 chip systems that are just a little bit smaller than a megawatt each. We also replaced the oil boilers because they had quite a few older oil boilers dotted around in each of the buildings. So we put in 2 new oil boilers that are much more efficient, but they act as backup for the biomass. And again, the heat is piped out to all the different buildings in the school through a district heating system. In this case, it's about 1 kilometre long, and they're saving about 860 tonnes of CO2 per annum. Norwich Cathedral, as I said, right in the middle of Norwich city centre. Their boiler is in the basement, so we supply them with pellets, and they've noticed a huge improvement in the warmth. Basically, you know how cold and drafty big churches can be. They comment how nice and toasty it is now. They're saving now about 124 tonnes of CO2 per annum. And finally, Cally Place Hotel, number of buildings, once again, all connected now up to a district heating system, and they're saving 290 tonnes of CO2 a year. So I think the final thing to say really is that if you do have buildings that you need to have help decarbonising, then we might be able to help you. So please do get in touch. Also, I'd urge you to have a look at the rest of the briefing papers, print them off, use them as cheat sheets, try and pretend that you know everything about it by just having a quick look at them from time to time. And then just finally to say thank you for listening.
Oh, very good. Yeah, there you go. That's good. Search AMP Clean Energy Briefing Papers. It's all there. Really good. We have got lots of questions. Keep them coming. Should we do the vote? Should we do the results of the vote?
Yes, let's do that.
Let's have a look. So,
how do I?
Here we go. So, does your business or organisation currently have a plan in place? 14% yes, 64% kind of, 21% no. What you thought?
Well, I mean, it's not very scientific, because quite frankly, if everyone had a solution, they wouldn't be watching this.
No, but I think it's probably about right. I think, to get about 10% saying that they've got some plans, I'm quite amazed at that, actually. 14%. Yeah. You covered a lot of things. I will come to questions, so keep them coming, because we've got half an hour left. One thing that struck to me, and you're going to hate me for this, market-based mechanism for low carbon heat. Oh God, it sounds appalling. So explain to me what you think this might be, because obviously if we've looked back at all the things, and I think your carrot stick analogy is the right one, government has for the last 12 years, I've been in it, you've been longer, used a lot of carrot, from feed-in tariffs, RHI, all of that. To create a market system for low carbon heat, how do you think they'll start to go about that? Because you'll have to create something quite A, innovative, B, affordable for businesses, particularly where we are right now, after Stuart's predictions, looking even for 4 or 5 years. So how do you think they'll start to pull it together? And will it be done through BAID, or will be the EA involved, or how do you think they'll put it together? Because it's been in weird places, all this stuff about kind of emissions and decarbonisation.
So they use the word obligation, which to me sounds as if it will be similar to the renewable obligation.
Right.
As in there will be a ramping up of requirements for manufacturers to supply. So they might be asked, in year one, you have to supply 25% or 10% of your heating equipment. That has to be low carbon. The next year it'll be 20%. The next year it'll be 30%, and there will be a requirement for them to declare the numbers that they have sold. And if those numbers are not met, there will be some kind of pay into a pot, which potentially could then be recycled back to those people who've delivered more. Kind of thing.
This is a slide I was looking for. So you reckon an obligation on fossil fuel heating manufacturers. So yes. for in terms of the actual end users who are on this webinar, really you're looking for what will come from the products you'll buy rather than what you would have to do yourself, you think?
Yes, exactly. So if there is some kind of recycling mechanism, what that could potentially mean is that it could help support those manufacturers that are going a bit further and a bit faster. So those manufacturers that, in the year that they are required to deliver 10%, they've actually delivered 20%. They might get back some of the fines, if you like, for those who haven't delivered, to allow them to sell their equipment at a lower price. So that's how it might benefit.
It's really interesting, because if you look at obviously the RHI, which I'll ask you, was it a success in your view?
Oh, absolutely. In my view, I mean, yes.
You would say that,
I would say that, of course. Of course, but if you
It
look at
shifted
how
things.
much,
It has shifted things, hasn't it?
yeah, and if you look at how much carbon saving it's delivered, yes, I think it. There's no question. When you look at the Duke's data on how much the RHI has delivered, I think it's something like 21%, something from memory. I can't remember exactly how much, but that's quite a significant proportion of carbon savings for the UK.
But I mean, the examples you gave there, the schools and all the biomass, and that's pretty much the government sort of really incentivized with RHI biomass, didn't it?
Well, it actually, our biomass got the lowest tariff of all of the technologies. So it's just that biomass was already the lowest cost option.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could argue that it shouldn't have been incentivized as much as it did, but it was already the cheapest option per ton of carbon.
And we have to be
government.
realistic. That's what businesses will look for, won't they?
Absolutely, yes.
Do you think that, and particularly the other one, and I'm sorry to go on this, but I think that I found this the most. No, I'm not saying it wasn't all interesting, Jill, but this one was the one that really got me, because if you look at where public sector decarbonisation is, that is a legitimate driver, right? It's a real forceful driver, legislative driver, sorry, rather than legitimate driver, for pretty much a lot of the people who will be coming to the Big Zero show, a lot of people on this call today, because they have to do this. That seems a very staggeringly high goal of 75%.
Yeah.
It's and the government has to show leadership. And I spoke to someone from Nottingham Council about this not that long ago on the podcast, and they'd done a trial and they'd shown something like this to try and decarbonise some housing stock, but it was a one-off job which cost 700 grand for 10 houses. She said, look, we need more. It's proved it works, but this heat decarbonisation for public sector buildings is a real challenge. How do you see that panning out?
You're right. The public sector has always been needed to be the leader, and it's with all the challenges that local authorities and other public sectors are facing, it's extremely difficult for them. I can't see any other way for government to lead the charge with public buildings other than continuing to support through some kind of mechanism like the SALIX funding. I mean, it has to happen. They have to continue to support it. And having worked in the public sector before, it's the right thing to do. To lead by example.
No, of course.
Yeah. So I think it will continue. I mean, there are further rounds expected of the public sector decarbonisation scheme. So I don't see any end to it. I don't think. Other people may. It's not my field at the moment, so other people
understood.
correct me. But I think it will continue in that vein.
And just before we start looking at the questions from everyone, do you think that this interaction of a kind of the market base pushing on the manufacturers, right? Take the heat out, take the embodied carbon out, all of that sort of stuff at the beginning, and then things like, as you said, public sector always drives what happens with private sector, because that's loads of people have contracts with schools and hospitals and things like that. So do you think those two things working in tandem might be the push, that you actually have the kind of at the manufacturing, the OEMs are starting to say, we're changing it, we're making it better, we'll be responsible for what you put in, and then the public sector driving, I want to cut.
I think that we haven't got enough policy yet.
Whoa.
There isn't. I think we need more. We need
civil
more
servants
policy.
in Wales will be cheering right now.
There's not. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people on this call who don't know what to do, and there's not enough stick for them to do it, and there are too many pressures on their purses with other things to need to worry about it. But it's very clear that policy is coming. There's no question that it is coming, and when it does come, everybody will have to do it. So that's why I say it's good to do it now, whilst, because as the demand increases, so too, as we know, will the costs.
Yeah.
So bite the bullet, get on with it while it's relatively cheap.
Yeah. No, it's fair enough. Right, should we start looking at some of the questions? Thank you very much, ladies and gents. Keep them coming. We'll try and get through as many as we can in the next sort of 20 minutes. Let's start with the first one. So, heat pump first. This person says, I can see this is a good option for new buildings, but how realistic is it for existing buildings? That's for sure. Not easy. How do you answer that one?
No, it's not easy. And you know, I wish I had £1 for every time somebody said I can't put a heat pump into my building. You've got to have the right space. You've got to have the right heating system installed, or else you have to pull all the heating system out and replace it with something else. It's not for everybody, and it's very expensive if you want to retrofit
Do you
it
think
properly.
we can retrofit?
Yes,
I can see it in new builds easily, but do you actually think that technology will start to come, the cost will come, where you can start to retrofit systems in certain
it's
buildings?
possible. Yeah, of course it's possible. Anything's possible, isn't it? It's just about cost and space as well. So, if you've got a tower block full of lots of individual flats, then that's going to be challenging. No matter what, even if you try and pull everything out and replace it, because you just don't have the physical ability to put heat pumps into all of those properties. You don't, just, it's not possible. But in a lot of situations, it is possible. So, as I said in the presentation, no one size fits all, and it's people, it's boots on the ground looking at these systems. I wish I had £1 for every time I've been to a site survey to look at what's there, and I hadn't anticipated what was there until I was actually there.
Just a quick one before we get to the next question. You know, you showed I think it was Norwich. Was it Norwich Cathedral?
Yeah.
Well, that was biomass, was it?
That's all of those were biomass. Yeah.
So you can see that you put in the boiler just where the old boiler is. Can you see things like heat pumps working in old buildings? Like, really difficult, isn't it?
It is challenging. It's challenging because they tend to
start, things like that.
Yeah. It's a challenge. It's not. I don't believe. I mean, there are people who know more about heat pumps than I do, and I don't think it's impossible. And especially hybrid heat pumps, so where you're using the heat pump to take off some of the heat load, but then boosting it with perhaps a biomass system. I don't know. But yes, it is more challenging in older buildings, which is why I wanted to show you those case studies.
Next question. Navigating the net zero building landscapes. How important do you think embodied, well, we've already touched on this, will take space in shaping reduction measures as well as in energy efficiency? And we talked a little bit about that on yesterday's one as well. So embodied carbon, I mean, that's really, we did a film about a hotel that's the first, well, he claims to be first net zero hotel in the UK, because he's counted for all the embodied carbon in the bar, the beds, and all of that sort of stuff. So, and then his heating system is, there you go, biomass, etc., etc. How do you think that will work out? Because that's quite interesting, isn't it? How much you say that if you're creating a net zero building, the embodied carbon, as well as efficiency, you've got to take account for it, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. It's a difficult one, especially with buildings, because there's an awful lot of concrete, which can be quite high carbon. I think that's a good question. As we move towards more decarbonisation of materials, so using hydrogen in steel manufacturing and alternative sources of heat for concrete manufacture, then those embedded carbon elements will decline. But we're talking about buildings that are being built now in that policy, and they will be there for some time before they
so
can be.
You can't really do much about that, except I suppose you could try and find some way of calculating an offset. That probably be the solution at present, would it?
That's potentially a solution. Yeah.
Industrial buildings, someone says, they're discussed. It's fairly true. Classed as hard to heat. Flipping it. I've been to some factories that are freezing. Biomass heating provides a main option for non-fossil heating. But what impact would an increase in biomass heating installations have on biomass stock source and supply? And do you think the RHI commercial will be replaced?
Well, let's tackle the second question first. No, I think it's probably, well, it is very unlikely that we're going to get another RHI, much as we would love it. Yeah, so that's probably not going to be an option. Can I just find the question again so I can try and understand?
Hang on, let me just go down and there we go. If you go down, you should see the one. Many industrial buildings will be classed as hard to heat. Biomass heating provides the main option for non-fossil heating, but what impact would an increase in biomass heating installations and stock source supply have? And that's quite interesting because, yes, if more people use it, you could find, sorry, I can't give you one.
Yeah, okay, so this is a question about availability of equipment and availability of fuel, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay. So I used to work for the Forestry Commission, and we did a lot of work on what
No wonder you love biomass so much. Should have declared an interest at the beginning.
Yeah, I should. Yeah. So we did a lot of soul searching about this, and at what point, at what point will the available material, the available sources of wood fuel be starting to dwindle, and then we start eking into the stocks, and then effectively, we're declining the carbon stock. And we were, this was a few years ago, and we were so far off getting to that point that we just put it back to the back of our minds. Obviously, with Drax now and some of the big biomass power producers, and the fact that they're importing huge amounts of material, that is starting to get a bit closer. We're still quite a long way off declining. So, because essentially all the forestry material in the world has a mean annual increment. It produces this much extra wood each year.
Yeah.
And as long as you're not tipping over into existing stocks and you're only utilizing that mean annual increment, then all that's happening is that the forests are still increasing.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that we have to always keep an eye on. And part of the IPCC's job is to make sure that happens. We don't tip over into eking.
But what about in terms of actual supply of the equipment, the boilers, and all that? Because if you suddenly have a massive take up, that we've seen it with EVs now, you can't get them because they can't get the chips for them. Right now.
We effectively had that with the RHI in the sort of 5 years into it. We had a big uptake of biomass, and there was a huge demand, and we did see a little bit of a drop off in the amount of supply, but it most markets correct themselves relatively quickly, and I see that that a lot of these suppliers are Austrian, they're Italian, German. Their market has continued to grow. It's not dropped off because RHI has stopped. It's continued to grow, and in fact, in Italy and France, they've had a massive bumper year of installations of biomass, and the manufacturing of biomass industry is growing hugely. So
if someone's thinking about it, they shouldn't worry about supply.
I don't think there's anything to worry about. No.
Right, next one. Will net zero buildings navigation or transition to it be focusing on materiality in blimey? God, I don't know who asked this question. Well done. It's like a
very
PhD.
Intelligent people out there.
Materiality in its inception stage itself, rather than on retrofitting and phasing out. Now that real estate has put a huge onus on compliance and aligned to carbon markets, if off-grid zone and phase outs, if off-grids are phase outs as per one of the slides, will it be decarbonised with cloud-based grid monitoring? I have no idea what that question means, but anyway, I'll leave that to you.
Okay, let me try and tackle that. So materiality in its inception stage.
I think what they're trying to say is it going to be about, the availability of what you've got to begin with?
We can't ask the person to explain, can we?
If you did ask that question, I'll tell you, we'll come back to that question. It's a really good one, I'm sure, but I'm a bit too thick to understand it. So if you could help and sort of decarbonize that question for me, that would be good. Right, next one. Decentralized energy and heating. Will industrial estates, farms, etc., have the opportunity to stand alone and self-sufficient heat in terms of on-site generation? For example, the Royal Agricultural Society published a report, Farm for the Future, which highlights such opportunities. That's a really big one, isn't it? Agricultural land and I mean, I know you guys as a company have worked with agricultural producers, etc.
Yeah.
Do you think that will be, a big area where they could actually have, I don't know, the farm decarbonizes, but then it supplies the local area, etc., or stores it and sells it? How do you see that panning out?
Yeah, I think we would be moving towards that kind of model. We've certainly seen that in places like Scandinavia, where there are thousands of agriculturally owned biomass district heating systems, and I keep talking about biomass, but it doesn't necessarily have to be biomass. Where a bunch of agricultural farmers have clubbed together to build the equipment and to supply their local town. There's really no reason why we couldn't do something like that in the UK, especially in rural areas. So yeah, I definitely think that this is another diversification option for agricultural businesses.
And also, I suppose that's a way of, you look at it, how do you decarbonize countryside? And that's, we always think about, big cities, right? Go in, building a district heating system, whatever, but we have to take everyone with us.
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of investigations into whether kind of village level district heating might work, and it's never quite made the financial grade because district heating pipe is quite expensive and per meter. But the dynamics of the economics are changing so rapidly now that some of those schemes that I've looked at in the past could well now be worth doing when you compare them to oil and other sources of heating.
Gosh, we're nearly out of time. 8 minutes. Right, let's try and get through as many we can. Should an updated building management system be a priority? I suppose that's probably true.
Well, there's lots of building management systems out there, and some of them are smart and digital. If you're talking about should your particular building have an updated, yes, absolutely. This is all part of controls.
You can't measure it.
If you don't know what's going on in your building, how do you know how to fix it? So definitely that should be a priority, and that should go into the box of, energy efficiency that I said you should always tackle first.
Yeah. Gill, your example, this is good. Gill, your examples are all solid buildings. Are you also working on industrial buildings, engineering, manufacturing, which are really, so basically sheds?
Yes, actually.
Can you make a shed energy efficient, Gill?
Yes. So we have.
I've got one in my garden.
We've just put three into some high, I won't name any names, but some very high-end yacht building companies that effectively have tents that they're metal framed, material covered, but they're permanent buildings, and it's not ideal, but that's how most industrial buildings have been built, and they still have to be heated. The secret is to just avoid waste as much as you possibly can. So if there are vents, they need to be closed as much as possible, and just do whatever you can in terms of energy efficiency. But we've done it, and we are doing it.
Okay. That person's come back. The materiality question,
Great.
the PhD question. The question on materiality meant how important is it to map the materials we procure? Okay, if we want to transition to net zero buildings as emissions quantification reduction. But yeah, okay, right, that makes much more sense.
Oh, okay. So I think it's really important, and actually this is becoming even more important. And if you want to have a look at it's given me a chance to talk about this, the case study, that the briefing paper about monitoring and disclosure, then it talks about how you have to look at your scope 3 emissions, which is basically the emissions of your suppliers. And if you're a very large business now, you're required to do that as part of your governance, your social responsibility. I think it's good practice to do it, and actually this is probably the thing that's going to drive decarbonisation more than anything else, rather than policy and rather than incentives and any of that kind of thing. I think you mentioned the other day, didn't you, Sumit, that you picked up a product and it talked about its carbon emissions. It's the review of carbon emissions is getting a lot tighter, so it's getting a lot more difficult to greenwash products. Accreditations for correctly allocating or accounting for your emissions are becoming much more widespread, and accountancy of carbon accountancy is becoming a lot more professional and reliable. So it's becoming a much more competitive angle, and if you're not counting your carbon but your competitors are, they're going to have an advantage over you. So again, it's all about trying to jump on that bandwagon, get yourself into the mindset of not just thinking about money, but thinking about carbon as well at the same time. And embedded energy is all part of that.
Yeah. Probably going to be our last one, I think. Many SMEs will be rather alarmed by the stick or obligation approach. With productivity, this is a very important one, actually. With productivity already really struggling, what do you think the constant would be on the UK manufacturing sector? And this is a really difficult balance for government, isn't it? Yes, decarbonise and get it on. But if you have to do things that are going to cost a lot, where we are right now, particularly manufacturing, it's very difficult. Brexit, pandemic, the Ukraine war, all of these things. How do you see that? Because that's probably not something for you, but it's probably a policy thing, isn't it, really? To get the balance right?
But actually it comes back to my last point about the competitive angle. So if you're not dealing with your carbon, but your competitors are, they may well be paying more, but they may well also be selling more. So I think a lot of people now are switching their view. That some people will pay more for something that is greener. Some won't. Obviously, some people are always just going to be going for the cheapest option. But especially the millennials, and especially the ones who are supporting the Greta Thunberg, I can't speak,
Greta Thunberg,
of the world, they're prepared to pay more, and they will be choosing the companies that have demonstrated.
Yeah, they're prepared to make. I'm going to say this as the father of a million. They're prepared to make for, because they don't bloody pay for it themselves. But anyway, that's a different one. Right, I think we're pretty much out of time. Oh, well, hang on, Mike. Hello, Mike. Very informative and enjoyable. Sumit, no, not me. Gill, fantastic. Got lots more questions on heating. Keep up the good work, especially with the government lobbying. There you go, Gill. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. We didn't get to all the questions, but we will pass them on. And I'm sure that if you have any others, then Gill will be happy to answer them offline, so you can get in touch. I would just like to say thank you very much to Amp Clean Energy for this series. Here you are. Go to their website, Clean Energy Briefing Papers, and you'll be able to look at all the things we've covered over the last 3 days. Gill, I think you'll be I really hope, in a way, you get your wish, but I don't. But more legislation means more that we've got to cover. But let's see how we go. Thank you very much for your time today, Gill. Really
Thanks, Sumit. Thank you for helping us.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you want to catch up on this, you can, because we've got it on Future Net Zero in about 10-15 minutes, and all the materials there. And of course, if you have questions for Gill, then pass them to us and we'll forward them. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Bye.